Be honest with me here. You've definitely heard this one before, right? We literally only use 10% of our brains. Maybe you caught a sci-fi movie where someone unlocks that missing 90% and boom, they're suddenly moving things with their mind. Or, maybe a teacher casually mentioned it back in grade school. It just kind of feels right, doesn't it? Like we all have this massive untapped potential just waiting there. Well, what if I told you that this completely accepted fact is absolutely 100% biologically false? Today, we're diving into this explainer to confront the cognitive dissonance that hits us when our so-called common sense turns out to be pure fiction.
You see, Emory University psychologist Scott O. Lilienfeld literally spent his entire career tracking down these fictions, and as he put it so perfectly in his research, myths matter. When we believe falsehoods about how the human mind actually works, it's not just a harmless piece of bad trivia. It actually leads to unwise decisions, unfair stigmas, and just a profound misunderstanding of ourselves and the people around us. Believing the wrong things, it has real-world consequences.
So, welcome to this explainer. Today, we are shattering misconceptions. We are going to use the fascinating work of Dr. Lilienfeld, along with some rigorous scientific research, to completely dismantle the pop psychology claims that we've all absorbed from movies, social media, and just everyday conversations. Get ready to have your mind changed about, well, your mind. All right, let's dive right in. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the danger of pop psychology. Second, brain power and intelligence. Third, the malleable human mind. Fourth, behavior, society, and stigma. And finally, number 5, empowering your critical thinking. Starting off with Section 1, the danger of pop psychology and why we believe what isn't true. Now, before we start debunking things left and right, I want to say right up front that no one should feel foolish for believing these myths. I mean, they're literally designed to be appealing. They stick around because it's essentially a perfect storm. The media sensationalizes extreme cases. The claims have this intuitive appeal that just feels right to us, and thanks to our own confirmation bias, once we buy into a myth, like, say, sugar making kids bounce off the walls, we only ever notice the evidence that supports it. We end up relying on personal anecdotes instead of rigorous peer-reviewed research. Moving on to Section 2, brain power and intelligence, where we'll explore the myths holding back your real cognitive potential. Let's circle back to that 10% myth we started with. That massive 90% chunk we think is just sitting there dormant, waiting to be unlocked. Biologically speaking, that is completely impossible. Think about it. Our brains consume a whopping 20% of our body's energy. Evolution would never, ever allow for that kind of massive inefficiency. Modern brain imaging clearly shows that we use all parts of our brain over time. Every single area has a known function, and damage to even a tiny, tiny part causes noticeable effects. So, no, we don't have these dormant zones waiting to be activated. Our brains are already fully utilized powerhouses.
And that brings us to a massively popular education myth, learning styles. Oh, we love to label ourselves, right? I'm a visual learner or I'm an auditory learner. But here's the kicker. There is absolutely zero empirical backing for this. Studies show that matching teaching methods to a student's preferred style doesn't actually improve their test scores or comprehension at all. So instead of boxing ourselves into these really simplistic categories, we should be relying on evidence-based techniques. Things like retrieval practice, where you actively test your memory rather than just passively rereading a textbook. And the best part? That benefits all learners across the board.
Okay, so what about IQ? A super common modern myth claims that IQ tests are basically useless and literally only measure how good you are at taking tests. But that's a massive oversimplification. While it is absolutely true that environmental factors and cultural biases need to be carefully considered, intelligence tests do measure meaningful cognitive abilities. They actually have really strong predictive validity for academic and occupational success. Are they the only factor that matters in a person's life? No, of course not. But they are a highly valid, scientifically backed metric. Definitely not just some meaningless puzzle.
All right, on to Section 3, the malleable human mind. Let's look at the myths surrounding memory, hypnosis, and dreams.
A lot of us think of our memory like a video camera. You hit record, and then years later you just hit play. But the reality is that human memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. It works like this. You experience an event, you recall it, and in that actual process of recalling, you reconstruct it. This means our memories can be so easily distorted over time by emotions, beliefs, or even just outside suggestions. It's exactly why eyewitness testimony can sometimes be incredibly unreliable. Your memory isn't this locked steel vault. It's a living, shifting narrative. And this crazy malleability of the mind brings us straight to hypnosis. You can go ahead and forget the swinging pocket watches and the idea of being put into this zombie-like trance where you're suddenly clucking like a chicken on stage. In reality, hypnosis is just a normal cognitive process. It involves focused attention and heightened suggestibility, sure, but it does not induce some unique, altered state of consciousness. And most importantly, you cannot be forced to do things against your moral will. That exact same scientific reality check applies to our dreams, too. If you've ever dreamt of your teeth falling out, I bet someone told you it means you're secretly anxious about money or losing power, right? Well, here is the truth. Dreams do not possess inherent, universal symbolic meanings. They aren't revealing deeply repressed truths hidden in some universal dream dictionary. Instead, research indicates that dreams mostly just reflect our daily lives, our routine activities, and our everyday waking concerns.
And hey, speaking of things that definitely aren't universal, let's talk about the dreaded midlife crisis. We treat this like a biological inevitability. You hit 45, you suddenly buy a bright red sports car, and you panic. But statistical findings show this is pretty much entirely a cultural myth. Only a very small percentage of people actually experience a true crisis. In fact, in a lot of cultures, the transition into middle age is super peaceful. Many individuals actually report increased happiness and life satisfaction as they get older.
Which brings us to this really profound realization from the source material. Our grief is as individual as our lives. For decades, pop psychology has aggressively pushed this idea that there are 5 fixed, universal stages of grief that every single person must pass through in a very specific order. But the science says otherwise. Because we are individuals with incredibly complex minds, our healing processes just do not fit neatly onto a timeline. They are entirely, beautifully unique to us.
Let's move to Section 4, Behavior, Society, and Stigma. This is where we examine the very real-world cost of these psychological myths.
One of the absolute most dangerous myths pushed by media sensationalism is the inherent link between mental illness and violence. But the actual data paints a completely different picture. Mental illness alone rarely causes violence. In fact, substance abuse is a significantly stronger predictor. The vast majority of violence in our society is committed by people without mental illness. Tragically, people struggling with mental illness are far more likely to be the victims of violence rather than the perpetrators. Believing this myth doesn't keep anyone safe. It just fuels cruel and completely unnecessary stigma.
Similarly, we are always so incredibly quick to blame violent media, like video games or action movies, for violent behavior in the real world. It's just a really easy scapegoat. But media effects are highly complex. While exposure to violent media might temporarily increase aggressive thoughts, it does not directly cause violent behavior. Interestingly enough, over the past few decades, as media violence has absolutely skyrocketed, actual violent crime has decreased. If we want to mitigate violence, we have to look at broader, systemic risk factors and improve our media literacy, rather than just relying on moral panics and pointing fingers at screens.
The media also totally skews our view of mental health treatment. TV shows constantly insist that to heal, a therapist has to help you uncover this deeply repressed childhood trauma. However, there is very little scientific evidence supporting the idea of perfectly repressed memories. Plus, present-focused therapies, like cognitive behavioral therapy, are highly effective. You don't always have to go digging through your past to heal. Often, the best path forward is just building robust coping skills for the challenges you're facing right here, right now.
Finally, Section 5, Empowering Your Critical Thinking and How to Spot These Myths Before They Take Root.
Now, Dr. Lilienfeld didn't just write this to ruin your favorite movie tropes. He wanted to arm you with a mental toolkit. To combat these myths, you really have to stay vigilant. Question those psychological claims that seem just a little too good to be true, like effortlessly unlocking hidden brain powers. Look for peer-reviewed science, not just some catchy clickbait headline. And most importantly, be fiercely aware of your own cognitive biases. And always, always seek out the consensus of experts over whoever happens to be the loudest voice in the room.
Wow, okay. We've covered a lot of ground today, dismantling everything from how much of your brain you actually use, to the reality of human memory, to the real harm of societal stigmas. But science is a continuous process of asking better and better questions. So I'll leave you with this thought. Knowing how easily our minds adopt appealing fiction as fact, what common-sense psychological truth are you going to question next? Keep learning, keep questioning, and thanks for listening to this explainer.